The morning Marcus Holt died, nobody in the intensive care unit of Meridian General Hospital noticed that Celeste Abara had been awake for 19 consecutive hours. Not the attending physicians who swept through like weather systems, loud, disruptive, and gone before you could brace yourself. Not the hospital administrator who walked the floors every Tuesday morning with a clipboard and a smile that never reached his eyes. Not even the other nurses who were fighting their own battles against exhaustion and understaffing and the particular brand of loneliness that came from caring deeply about strangers who didn't always survive. Nobody noticed Celeste. That was in many ways the whole story. But Marcus Holt noticed. He was 73 years old, a retired jazz musician from Baltimore with tobacco-stained fingers and a laugh that had once filled entire clubs with warmth. He'd been admitted 6 days earlier with congestive heart failure, and in those 6 days, Celeste had become the steady axis around which his frightened world turned. She remembered that he liked his water with exactly 2 ice cubes, that he hated the sound of the television after 9 p.m., that his daughter Renee lived in Phoenix and couldn't afford the flight, and that this fact broke something in him every single morning when he woke up and she wasn't there. "You're going to be all right, Mr. Holt," Celeste had told him the night before, adjusting his oxygen line with hands that moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had done 10,000 small acts of healing. "Your numbers are improving, doctor. Whitfield reviewed your chart this morning." Marcus had looked at her with those dark, tired eyes. "Baby girl," he'd said, "you're the only one who actually sees me in here." He passed at 6:47 a.m., quietly, between nurse checks. Celeste was the one who found him. She was the one who held his still warm hand for 30 seconds before she called it in. 30 seconds that nobody gave her, that she simply took because somebody had to mourn Marcus Holt properly in that sterile room, and it was going to be her. She documented everything, pulled his chart, flagged an irregularity in his medication schedule from the previous evening, a dosage adjustment that had been ordered verbally by Dr. Preston Caldwell, but never properly entered into the system. It wasn't necessarily what killed Marcus. The man had a failing heart, but it was sloppy. And it was the kind of sloppiness that accumulated in hospital systems until one day it wasn't just sloppy, it was catastrophic. Celeste wrote it up, filed it through the proper incident reporting channel, initialed it, dated it, and went back to work. Preston Caldwell, MD, was the kind of man who took up space as though he'd been specifically designed for it. 6'2", silver-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved for the purpose of delivering authoritative diagnoses. He had been chief of cardiology at Meridian General for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had developed the particular arrogance of a man who had never once been meaningfully challenged. He found Celeste at the nurse's station at 10:15 that same morning. She was charting. Her back was straight. It was always straight, a habit from her mother, to a Ghanaian woman named Adwoa who had raised 3 children in a 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta while working double shifts at Grady Memorial and telling them every single night, "You carry yourself like you belong everywhere, because you do." Nurse Abara. Caldwell's voice dropped the temperature in the immediate vicinity by several degrees. "I understand you filed an incident report this morning." Celeste looked up. She did not flinch. "Yes, Dr. Caldwell. Regarding Mr. Holt's medication record from last evening. I ordered that adjustment verbally." "I understand that. The concern is that it wasn't entered into the system in time to—" "The patient had end-stage congestive heart failure." His voice climbed not to a shout but to something worse. That cold, controlled volume that powerful men use when they want to remind you exactly where you stand. Several heads in the nurse's station turned. He didn't seem to care, or perhaps he preferred an audience. He was not going to recover. "What exactly do you think your little report is going to accomplish, besides creating unnecessary paperwork and casting aspersions on this department?" "It's protocol, Dr. Caldwell. Every irregular—" "You're just a nurse." The words came out like a diagnosis, flat and final and utterly certain. He said it the way people said, "You're just a child," or "You're just a woman," as though the word just were doing serious structural work, holding a ceiling in place above her head. "You chart, you administer, you follow orders. You don't investigate, you don't question clinical decisions. Wanik, and you certainly don't file reports about physicians who have forgotten more about cardiology than you will ever learn. He straightened his already straight tie. Pull the report. Consider this a courtesy warning. The nurse's station was very quiet. Celeste held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said simply, I won't be pulling the report, Dr. Caldwell. Have a good morning. He left. The silence he left behind was the kind that precedes either a storm or a reckoning. Diane Foster, a charge nurse who had been at Meridian General for 22 years and had seen most things twice, leaned over and said very quietly, Girl, you know what you just did, right? Celeste picked up her pen. I documented a medication irregularity. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. She looked at Diane. Can I do it again? Celeste Abara was 38 years old. She had a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Emory University, a Master's in Healthcare Administration from Johns Hopkins that she had earned online over 4 grinding years while working full-time, and a reputation in 3 different hospital departments as the nurse you wanted in the room when things went wrong. She had grown up in Atlanta, the middle child of Adwoa and Kofi Abara, both immigrants from Ghana who had built their American life one careful brick at a time. Her father drove a delivery truck and read biographies of great men and women every night before bed. Her mother had been a CNA before she was a nurse, and a nurse before she was a charge nurse. And she had taught Celeste the most important lesson about healthcare early. The patient in the bed is always the most important person in the room, not the most powerful, not the most credentialed, the most important. Celeste had carried that lesson like a lantern through 15 years of hospital work, through the double shifts and the lateral violence between nurses and the physicians who talked past her like she was a fixture, through the patient who died because nobody listened when she flagged his declining oxygen saturation, through the lawsuit that followed, a lawsuit that vindicated her documentation but left her emotionally hollowed for a full year, through her marriage to Darius Cole, a high school football coach with a generous laugh, and through the comfortable, a honest love they had built together in a house in Decatur with a porch where they sat on weekend mornings with coffee and said whatever was actually true. I poked the bear today, she told Darius that evening, sitting on that porch with her feet curled under her and her 3rd cup of coffee growing cold. Darius looked at her over the rim of his mug. He was a big man, former defensive lineman, with a face built for gentleness. How big a bear? Preston Caldwell. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, how poked? She told him the whole story. He listened the way he always listened, completely without rushing to the end. When she finished, he set down his mug and said, You did the right thing. I know. It's going to cost you. I know that too. He reached over and took her hand. Sybil, what do you need? She thought about Marcus Holt's still warm hand in hers that morning, about the way he'd said, You're the only one who actually sees me, about the weight of being invisible to everyone except the people who were dying. I need to not quit, she said. Darius squeezed her hand once. Then don't. The retaliation came dressed as administrative coincidence. Within 2 weeks of the incident report, Celeste found herself removed from the ICU and reassigned to a general medical floor, ostensibly due to staffing needs. According to the memo from nursing administration, the general floor was understaffed, chaotic, and stripped of the intensive monitoring equipment and specialist support that made her skills most effective. It was a demotion in everything but name. Her schedule changed without explanation. Whereas she lost 3 weekend shifts, which affected her income, and gained 3 overnight shifts in their place, a switch that played havoc with the rhythms she'd built with Darius and with the Johns Hopkins continuing education coursework she was quietly completing. She filed a grievance through HR. The grievance was received, acknowledged, and then set somewhere very still and dark where grievances went to be forgotten. She documented everything, every shift change, every interaction. She kept a separate personal log in a notebook at home, dating and timing each entry with the precision of someone who understood that detail was protection. She also quietly continued to be exceptional at her job. This is the part that the story of underdogs sometimes skips. The grinding daily excellence that happens while the injustice is also happening. The way you have to keep being good at the thing while the thing is being taken from you. Celeste didn't skip it. She showed up to every shift on the general medical floor, and she was the best nurse on that unit. And the patients felt it, even if nobody else seemed to. One of those patients was a woman named Gloria Chen, 61, admitted for a post-surgical infection following a hip replacement. Gloria was a retired HR executive with sharp eyes and a habit of observing people with professional intensity. She watched Celeste work for 4 days. On the 5th day, she said, "You're running this floor." Celeste was changing her IV bag. "I'm one of several nurses on this floor, Miss Chen." "You're running it," Gloria repeated. "The other nurses come to you. The residents come to you. You caught that interaction with my antibiotics, that doctor." "Hey, Patel's team missed." She paused. "What are you doing on a general floor?" "Staffing needs," Celeste said, and managed to say it without irony. Gloria studied her for a long moment. "What's your name again?" "Your full name." "Celeste Abara." Gloria nodded slowly, as though filing something carefully away. "Thank you, Celeste." It was a strange thing to say. Celeste noted it and moved on, because there were 11 other patients on her assignment, and the charge nurse had just called a rapid response on room 412. She didn't think about Gloria Chen again for 6 weeks. Meridian General Hospital had been once one of the better mid-sized hospitals in the Southeast. It had 340 beds, a solid cardiac care program built largely on Preston Caldwell's reputation, and a community health outreach program that served a predominantly black neighborhood on its eastern border, with genuine, if underfunded, commitment. In the past 3 years, it had begun to quietly deteriorate. The current president and CEO, a man named Raymond Fitch, had come from a hospital consulting background and had the particular vision of someone who understood healthcare as a business problem. Under Fitch, Meridian General had seen its patient satisfaction scores drop 14 points. Its nursing turnover rate had climbed to 41%, well above the national average. It had been cited twice by state regulators for staffing inadequacies, and a recent audit by an independent healthcare quality firm had flagged systemic issues with incident reporting culture. Specifically, that incident reports filed by nursing staff were being resolved at rates significantly below those filed by physicians. That last finding had caught the attention of someone on the hospital's board of directors. The board of Meridian General was composed of 11 people, community leaders, business executives, a retired judge, and 2 physicians. Most of them came to their quarterly meetings, reviewed the financials, asked the right questions, and went back to their other lives with reasonable confidence that the hospital was functioning as it should. One of them had started asking different questions. Her name was Dr. Beverly Okafor. She was 64 years old, a former emergency medicine physician who had stepped back from clinical practice a decade earlier to serve on several hospital and healthcare nonprofit boards. She was small and precise, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain, and she had a habit of reading audit reports the way other people read novels. From the beginning, with full attention, looking for the story underneath the numbers. The story she found underneath the Meridian General numbers was not a good one. She brought her findings to 2 other board members, a community banker named Harold Webb and the retired judge, a woman named Constance Phillips, and the 3 of them began, very quietly, to ask questions of their own. They requested internal data. They commissioned an external review that Fitch was told was routine. They talked to staff, individually and off the record, in the particular way that people with actual power can talk when they choose to use it carefully. 3 separate staff members, unprompted, mentioned the same name. If you're finding this story gripping, please subscribe to this channel. We tell stories like this every week, stories of resilience, justice, and the extraordinary ordinary people who change the world around them. And drop a comment below. Tell us your city. We want to know where in the world you're watching from. The call came on a Wednesday. Celeste was in the break room at 2 p.m., eating a sandwich she'd been trying to eat since noon, when her cell phone showed a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. 15 years of hospital work had trained her to eat whenever the opportunity existed. Because the opportunity was not guaranteed to exist again, she answered it anyway. "Miss Abara, this is Beverly Okafor. I'm a member of the board of directors at Meridian General. I was wondering if you might have time to meet with me this week, outside the hospital. Celeste set down her sandwich very carefully. May I ask what this is about, Dr. Okafor? It's about the kind of hospital we want to be, Beverly said, and I've heard you might have some thoughts on that. They met at a coffee shop in Midtown on Celeste's day off, a Thursday, gray and wet, the kind of Atlanta morning that smelled like rain and red clay. Beverly Okafor arrived first and was already seated when Celeste walked in. She stood to greet her, act which Celeste registered as a choice. Not everyone stood. They spent the first 20 minutes in the careful territory of mutual assessment. Beverly asked about Celeste's background, her training, her time at Meridian General. She listened with the quality of attention that Celeste associated with either very good physicians or very good lawyers. Then she placed a folder on the table and slid it across. It was the incident report, the one about Marcus Holt, and beside it, the grievance Celeste had filed, stamped received but with no resolution date, no outcome notation. And beside that, a spreadsheet of nursing reassignments over the past 6 months, with Preston Caldwell's cardiology department highlighted in yellow. Celeste looked at the documents for a long moment. And then she looked up. "How did you get these?" "I'm a member of the board," Beverly said simply. "I asked. Dr. Caldwell is—" "I know who Dr. Caldwell is." Beverly's voice was measured, but carried an edge of something old and well-maintained, like a blade that had been kept sharp across the decades. "I also know that the independent quality review we commissioned last quarter flagged Meridian's incident reporting resolution as a systemic problem. I know that nursing turnover in the cardiology department is running at 53%. And I know that 3 different staff members, when asked independently who they believed represented the values this hospital should have, said your name." She paused. "I'd like to understand why." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Outside, rain began to tap against the coffee shop window in a soft, irregular rhythm. "Because I keep showing up," she said finally. "Not out of heroism, not because I'm trying to make a point, because the patients are there and they need someone to show up, and I know how to do that." She looked at the incident report with Marcus Holt's name on it. Mr. Holt's daughter couldn't afford to fly in from Phoenix. He died in a room by himself. The least I could do was make sure his chart was accurate. Beverly Okafor looked at her for a long time. "Miss Abara," she said, "can I ask you something direct?" "Please." "You have a master's in healthcare administration from Johns Hopkins." "Yes." "You've been quietly completing additional leadership certifications for the past 2 years." Celeste held very still. "You've done your research." "I have." Beverly folded her hands on the table. "Nah, you're not just a nurse." The phrase landed strangely, not like Caldwell's version of it, which had been a ceiling, but like something almost the opposite, an opening. "I'm absolutely a nurse," Celeste said carefully. "That's not a small thing to be. But yes, I've been preparing for something more." "Why?" The honest answer surprised Celeste by arriving without hesitation, as though it had been waiting by the door. "Because I've watched this hospital from the inside for 7 years, and I know exactly what's broken, and I believe I know how to fix some of it. And I got tired of having opinions with nowhere to put them." Beverly smiled. Small, precise, real. Good answer. What Beverly Okafor did not tell Celeste in that coffee shop, not yet, it was the full scope of what the board was considering. Raymond Fitch had submitted his resignation 4 days earlier. Not publicly. It hadn't yet been announced. But he was leaving, and the board needed to move, and they had been in quiet discussions about the shape of Meridian General's next chapter. The board search committee had a short list of 3 external candidates, all of them credentialed, all of them with significant leadership experience. One was a hospital COO from Nashville. Another was a healthcare consultant with a track record in turnaround situations. The third was a physician administrator from a regional health system in North Carolina. All 3 were competent. None of them knew what it felt like to eat a sandwich at 2 p.m. That you'd been trying to eat since noon because your patients needed you, and the floor was understaffed and the incident reporting system was broken, but you filed the report anyway because Marcus Holt's daughter couldn't afford the flight from Phoenix. Beverly brought Celeste's name to Harold Webb and Constance Phillips the following Monday. She presented it not as sentimentality, but as strategy, a detailed case built on Celeste's credentials, her performance record, the specific institutional knowledge she carried, and the particular kind of leadership that the hospital's community needed to see modeled. Harold Webb, to his credit, listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "Oh, she's a nurse. She has a master's in healthcare administration from Johns Hopkins and 7 years of institutional knowledge," and Beverly replied. "The medical staff will push back. Some of them." "Yes, Caldwell will." "Caldwell," Beverly said, "is precisely why we need someone who isn't afraid of Caldwell." Constance Phillips had said nothing yet. She was looking at the summary document Beverly had prepared, turning pages with the unhurried focus of someone who had weighed arguments for a living. Finally, she looked up. "What does she want?" Constance asked. Beverly paused. "I'm not entirely sure she knows yet that this is on the table." Constance almost smiled. "Then perhaps we should tell her." The second meeting was not at a coffee shop. It was in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Buckhead, and Beverly arrived with Harold Webb and Constance Phillips. And the folder on the table this time was thicker, and it had Celeste's name on the tab. Celeste sat down across from all three of them and felt the specific quality of silence that precedes something that will change your life. And she sat in it without fidgeting, because her mother had taught her that too. When the room gets heavy, you get still. You don't run from the weight. You find out what it is. Beverly spoke first. She laid out the situation clearly: Fitch's departure, the board search, the external candidates, the internal deliberations. She presented Celeste's credentials. She spoke about what the board was considering. And as she spoke, Celeste's face remained composed, though something behind her eyes was moving fast. When Beverly finished, Celeste said, "You're considering me for the presidency of Meridian General." "We are. I'm a nurse. Not defensive, not self-deprecating, just true. You're a nurse with a master's in healthcare administration and 7 years of deep institutional experience and a demonstrated capacity to make difficult decisions under pressure and a record of prioritizing patient outcomes over professional convenience." Beverly looked at her. "And yes, you're a nurse. We consider that an asset." Celeste was quiet. The rain had followed her here, streaking down the tall windows. She thought about her mother at Grady Memorial, double shifts, a CNA badge, a teaching 3 children in a 2-bedroom apartment that you carry yourself like you belong everywhere. She thought about Preston Caldwell saying you're just a nurse in front of a room full of people. She thought about Marcus Holt's still warm hand. What would the search process look like, she asked. Preston Caldwell found out about Celeste's candidacy through a resident who had overheard something he shouldn't have in an elevator. By the time the rumor reached Caldwell, it had been in circulation for 48 hours and had collected additional details with each retelling, some of which were false and all of which infuriated him in principle. He called 3 board members he had personal relationships with. He sent a letter to the full board, framed as concern about institutional stability and appropriate credentialing for senior leadership, but stripped of that framing, simply a senior physician using the full gravity of his position to say, "This will not happen." He was not, in this, entirely alone. 3 department chiefs signed a letter supporting his concerns. 2 physicians who didn't feel strongly either way signed it because Caldwell asked them, and they found it easier to say yes than to explain why they were hesitant. The letter was careful and professional and used language about qualifications and customary pathways that was doing exactly the same structural work as the word just, holding a ceiling in place above a particular person's head. Celeste received a copy of the letter because Beverly Okafor forwarded it to her with a single line of accompanying text. "I thought you should see this. Your response, if any, should be your decision." Darius read the letter that night on the porch. He was quiet for a long time. "They're scared of you," he said finally. "They're dismissing me. People who are purely dismissive don't write 4-paragraph letters." He set it down. "What are you going to do?" Celeste thought about it. She thought about the easy answer, the press conference, the public statement, the direct confrontation. She thought about the satisfying theatrical image of walking into a room and dismantling Preston Caldwell's objections one by one. Then she thought about what actually changed things. Not the drama, the work. I'm going to prepare the best presentation of my vision for this hospital that anyone on that board has ever seen, she said, and I'm going to let that be my answer. She spent 3 weeks preparing it. She pulled Meridian General's last 5 years of patient satisfaction data and mapped it against staffing ratios and incident report resolution rates. She studied the external quality review. She talked, off the record, to nurses on every floor, to patient care techs, to residents who had done rotations at the hospital and left with specific frustrations. She talked to community leaders in the neighborhoods Meridian served. A pastor, a community health worker, the director of a local elder care nonprofit who said flatly that she discouraged seniors in her community from using Meridian General if they had other options. That last conversation stayed with her. She built her presentation around a single organizing idea, that the crisis at Meridian General was not primarily a financial crisis, or a credentialing crisis, or a staffing crisis, but a trust crisis. And that trust, once broken with patients and with the community and with the nursing staff who were leaving at extraordinary rates, could not be rebuilt by competent administration alone. It required a visible, credible commitment to a different set of values. So it required leadership that the most vulnerable people in Meridian's community would look at and believe. She was not arguing that she deserved the job because she was Black, or because she was a woman, or because she had been treated unfairly. Though all of those things were true and real and woven into the fabric of why this moment existed, she was arguing that she was the right person because she understood the problem from the inside out, in the specific cellular way that you can only understand something by having lived inside it, and because she had the training and the vision and the demonstrated commitment to fix it. She stood in front of the full board of Meridian General on a Tuesday morning in March, and she spoke for 45 minutes without notes, and she answered every question they put to her, including the hard ones, but including the ones about Caldwell, including the one about whether she could command the respect of the medical staff. To that last question, she said, "Respect isn't commanded, it's built. I'll build it the same way I built everything else, by doing the work, by being right more often than I'm wrong, and by never asking anyone else to hold a standard I'm not willing to hold myself." Some people in this hospital will be resistant. That's true of every leadership transition. My job will be to earn the skeptics and to protect the patients while I'm doing it. Constance Phillips, who had spent 40 years on a federal bench and had a finely calibrated detector for the difference between people who believed what they were saying and people who had learned to sound like they believed it. I made a small note on her legal pad. The board went into closed session at noon. The vote was 7-4. Beverly Okafor called Celeste at 3:47 p.m. She said, "I'd like to be the first to congratulate our new president and CEO of Meridian General Hospital." Celeste was sitting in her car in the hospital parking garage. She had come straight to work after the board presentation because she had a 3 p.m. shift, and she was not the kind of person who called in the day she might be changing her life. She said, "Thank you, Dr. Okafor." "Beverly." "Thank you, Beverly." She sat in the car for 4 more minutes. She texted Darius a single word, "Yes." His response was immediate and characteristic, a string of crying, laughing emojis followed by, "I'm making your mother's jollof rice tonight." Non-negotiable. She walked into the hospital and worked her shift. The announcement went out the following Monday morning, an internal notice to all staff, followed by a press release to local media. By midday, the story had been picked up by 3 Atlanta news outlets and 1 national healthcare trade publication, which ran it under the headline, "Floor Nurse to Corner Office, Meridian General's Unconventional CEO Appointment Signal Shift in Hospital Leadership Culture." The response inside the hospital was, depending on which hallway you were standing in, either electric or Arctic. In the nursing units, it spread the way wildfire spreads, fast and bright and with an energy that was almost physical. Diane Foster, the charge nurse who had been watching Celeste work for years, sat down at the nurses' station and cried briefly and without apology before standing back up and resuming normal operations. 3 nurses who had put in resignation letters in the past 2 months called HR to ask if the letters could be rescinded. A patient care technician named Dion put his fist through the air in the supply room and then looked around to make sure nobody had seen him, and then didn't care that they had. In the physician's lounge, the reaction was cooler. Some of the department chiefs waited to see which way the wind was blowing before they committed to any visible position. A few genuinely believed the appointment was wrong and said so to each other in terms that were, depending on who was using them, either principled or revealing. Preston Caldwell said nothing, publicly, for 48 hours. When he did speak, it was in the form of a meeting request, sent through his assistant, formal, to Celeste's new office, which she had not yet moved into. She accepted it. She had given considerable thought to how to handle this meeting. There was the version where she was magnanimous and warm and extended an olive branch, and they moved forward as cordial professionals. There was the version where she was cold and surgical and made clear exactly how much she knew and how little patience she had for posturing. There was the version where she sat in silence and let him speak first and reveal himself. What she actually did was sit down across from him in a conference room. On purpose, a conference room, not a corner office with a view, not a setting that emphasized hierarchy, and look at him directly and say, "I appreciate you requesting this meeting, Doctor. Caldwell, I think we should talk honestly." He looked older than he had in the weeks after their confrontation at the nurse's station. Not dramatically, he was still silver-haired and imposing, but something behind the architecture of his authority had shifted slightly, the way foundations shift under houses before anyone can see it in the walls. "I want to be candid with you," he said. "I had reservations about your appointment." "I know. I stand by some of those reservations." "All right." He looked at her, perhaps expecting more. "You're not going to respond to that?" "I was waiting to hear what the rest of your sentence was." He studied her for a moment. Something crossed his face. It might have been reassessment. "I also want to be candid that I said something to you in this hospital that was—" He paused, and the pause seemed to cost him something. "That was inappropriate, the manner in which I said it." Celeste waited. She gave him the silence. "I don't believe in making this position any harder than it needs to be," he continued. "The hospital has real problems. I have seen them. I have contributed to some of them, perhaps." That last phrase came out carefully, like something balanced on a fingertip. "I am willing to work with you if you are willing to work with me." "I am," Celeste said, "on one condition." "Which is?" "That you understand the terms are different now. You're a gifted cardiologist, Dr. Caldwell. Your clinical expertise is genuinely valuable to this hospital. But the culture of this department, the way nursing staff are treated, the way incident reports are handled, the way your word has functioned as the final authority, regardless of what the data said, that changes, not as punishment, as necessity, because that culture is why we're having this conversation in the first place." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to be harder to manage than Fitch," he said finally. "I'm not here to be managed," Celeste replied. Something happened in his face that was not quite a smile, but was the nearest neighbor of one. "Fair enough." It was not a resolution, it was a beginning. The fragile, necessary kind. Real things don't resolve, Celeste had learned. They evolve. The work was always going to be the work. Her first 90 days as president were the most exhausting of her life, and her life had contained some serious competition for that title. She did what she had promised the board she would do, while she started where the trust was most broken, with nursing staff. She convened listening sessions on every unit, every shift, including the overnight shifts, because she had learned what the overnight nurses knew, and she knew it was different from what anyone heard in the daytime. She brought a legal pad, and she took notes by hand, and at the end of each session she said, "I'm going to tell you what I heard, and I want you to tell me if I heard it right." What she heard was a workforce that was exhausted and demoralized and still, underneath all of it, deeply committed to the patients. What she heard was a culture of silence around safety concerns, not because people didn't see problems, but because they'd been trained to believe that naming problems created more danger than the problems themselves. What she heard again and again, here was Marcus Holt's words in different voices. "You're the only one who actually sees me." She overhauled the incident reporting system. She brought in an external consultant who had done this work at 3 other hospital systems, and she insisted on measuring outcomes, not just process. Not whether reports were filed, but whether they resulted in actual change. She created a nursing leadership council with real authority over scheduling and staffing decisions. She hired a chief nursing officer, a woman named Patricia Gaines from a hospital in Houston, who had a reputation that preceded her like a brass section, and gave her genuine power rather than a title. She also did something that nobody expected. She publicly acknowledged what had happened to her, not in the way of grievance or performance. In a town hall 3 weeks into her tenure, she stood in front of the assembled staff of Meridian General and said, "Some of you know that my path to this role was not conventional and that there were people in this institution who did not believe I belonged here. I want to address that directly, not to relitigate the past, but because I think the culture that produced that moment is the same culture we're here to change. I was told that I was just a nurse. I want to say, in front of all of you, that there is no just before nurse. There is no just before any person in this building who shows up and does this work. You are not just anything. You are the institution, and I intend to run it like I believe that." The town hall stayed in the building's memory the way certain things do, not as a moment of pure triumph, but as a declaration of intent. Something had shifted. People were watching to see if it held. It held. Marcus Holt's daughter Renee flew in from Phoenix 3 months after Celeste became president. She'd reached out through the hospital's patient relations office, a different patient relations office now, one that actually answered its phones, to say that she wanted to thank the nurse who had cared for her father. She'd been told that the nurse had a new title. They met in Celeste's office on a Tuesday afternoon. Renee was 50, with her father's dark eyes and a warmth that filled the room the way Marcus's laugh must once have filled clubs in Baltimore. She brought a framed photograph. Marcus on stage at a venue somewhere in the 1980s mid-song, face tilted up, completely transported. "He would have loved this," Renee said, looking at Celeste's office, her title on the door. He loved a good underdog story." "I didn't see it as an underdog story," Celeste said, and meant it. "I saw it as just doing the job. That's what underdogs always say," Renee smiled. "He told me about you. In our last phone call, he said there was a nurse who remembered his ice cubes." Celeste felt something move through her chest that she would later describe to Darius simply as big. "2 ice cubes," she said. Renee laughed. And yes, there was Marcus in it, the warmth that could fill a room. "He said you saw him. He said it mattered." She looked at Celeste steadily. "I wanted you to know that it mattered to me too, that somebody saw him." Celeste nodded. She trusted herself not to cry in this office because she had decided she would not use this office as a place for crying. But later, walking to her car in the parking garage, watch as she sat in the driver's seat for several minutes and let the grief and the gratitude and the weight of everything find its way through her. And then she called Darius and he said, "I'll start the rice." And she said yes and drove home. 9 months after Celeste Abara was named president of Meridian General Hospital, the hospital's patient satisfaction scores had risen 11 points. Nursing turnover had dropped to 22%. Still not where she wanted it, but trending hard in the right direction. The incident report resolution rate had improved from 61% to 94%, a number the external quality reviewers called remarkable in a follow-up audit they published as a case study. The Community Health Outreach Program on the Eastern Border had received a significant grant that Celeste had written herself, now at home, at her kitchen table, on a Sunday, because no one else had prioritized it, and she'd decided that was the kind of thing a president who had once been a floor nurse was in the best position to do. Preston Caldwell retired 8 months into her tenure. He did it with a dinner in his honor in a room full of physicians who had worked with him for years, and a speech that was genuinely moving, a tribute to a man who had done real good and real harm in the same career, which is the condition of most of us. Celeste spoke at the dinner. She said what was true and didn't say what wasn't, and the room respected her for both choices. She hired his replacement, a young cardiologist named Dr. Amara Jackson, 36 years old, one who had trained at Cleveland Clinic and had a reputation for being collaborative and data-driven and genuinely kind to nurses. Amara had grown up in Southside Atlanta, 15 minutes from the hospital. On her first day, a patient care tech named Dion told her where the good vending machines were and the locations of all the working elevators, and she wrote it all down because she said she wanted to know the whole building. Celeste watched this from the doorway of a unit she was walking and thought, yes, that's the thing. She still wore scrubs sometimes. Not always, not as a statement. She wore whatever the day required, but occasionally when the floor was short and the situation was urgent, and she had the clinical judgment to help. And there was a patient who needed a nurse, she would say to her assistant, "Tor, clear my 2 o'clock." And she would go to the floor and she would do the work. The residents were confused by this at first. The attending physicians were uncertain how to respond. The nurses understood immediately and completely, in the cellular way that nurses understand things. And they moved around her with the fluid coordination of people who recognize one of their own. She once heard a resident say in the hallway outside a patient room, not knowing she could hear, "Wait, is that the president?" And a nurse replied, voice dry and warm simultaneously, "That's Celeste. She's always been here." The moral of this story is not that systems are easy to change. They are not. It is not that goodness is always rewarded. It is not. It is not that one person can fix a broken institution through sheer excellence and force of will, because the truth is messier and more collective than that. The moral is what Celeste would tell you herself if you asked her on the porch on a Saturday morning with coffee growing cold. Visibility is a choice, not for the person who is being ignored. That choice belongs to the people with power, but the choice of how to respond to being invisible, that belongs to you. You can let it hollow you, or you can let it clarify you. She had been called just a nurse. She had chosen to hear it as a beginning. Marcus Holt's photograph sat on her desk, beside a framed quote she'd put there on her first day. Not from a famous leader or a business book, but from her mother, Adwoa, who had pressed a note into her hand the morning of her first day as president. It said, in her mother's small, precise handwriting, "You carry yourself like you belong everywhere." Because you do. She had belonged always. The room had just taken a while to know it, and every day in a hospital that was learning, imperfectly, incrementally, genuinely, to be what it was supposed to be, Celeste Abara walked the floors and saw her people and was seen and did the work. The work in the end was always the point. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and the people who refuse to stay invisible. And tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? We read every single one.